To chants of "America is the great Satan" and "No, no, Israel," thousands march in a funeral procession through Baghdad. This after the killing of Iran's top general and Iraqi militant leaders in a controversial US airstrike. Threatening power supplies to major Australian cities. Fires rage on across the southeast. 3,000 military reservists have been called up as New South Wales officials warn that worst-case scenario projections are coming to fruition. And at least 53 people are confirmed dead in and around Indonesia's capital, Jakarta. This is the result of landslides and floods triggered by torrential downpours. Rescuers struggle to locate victims buried under tons of mud. Thank you for joining us in the France 24 newsroom. I'm Nadia Sharbi. Angry funeral processions, threats of retaliation and rising regional tensions. That's the scene a day after the killing in a US airstrike of General Qasem Soleimani, the head of Iran's elite Quds force and the mastermind of the Islamic Republic's regional security strategy. Ordered by US President Donald Trump, the strike also killed top Iraqi militant leaders and marks a serious escalation of the standoff between Tehran and Washington, sparking fears of an all-out war. Selena Sykes tells us more.
Black flags fly across Tehran as Iranians mourn the death of Qasem Soleimani. The initial shock over the news of the US airstrike that killed the top military commander in Iraq on Friday soon turned into anger and concern on the streets of the Iranian capital. Some residents back Tehran's vow to take severe revenge, while others are worried about what happens next.
I don't think there will be a war, but we must definitely get revenge. There is no place for America to hide. It cannot hit and run away anymore.
If there is a war, I'm 100% sure that it's not to our benefit and that the situation will certainly get worse than it is already.
Concerns that continue to mount as Tehran escalates its war of words against Washington. The latest in a series of threats comes from a senior commander in Iran's Revolutionary Guard, quoted by an Iranian news agency saying Iran will punish Americans wherever they are in reach in retaliation for Soleimani's death. For now, Iran is preparing to commemorate the military commander. The country will observe 3 days of national mourning before a funeral and burial in Soleimani's hometown, Kerman, on Tuesday.
Well, after an Iranian official cited some 32 possible targets for retaliation, the world is waiting to see Tehran's next move. While a full-blown war with the United States seems unlikely, further escalation does appear inevitable. Wasim Kone takes a closer look at Iran's options.
Swift and immediate revenge, the promise of Iran's leaders in the wake of the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. But according to analysts, and despite intense domestic pressure to act, Tehran is unlikely to engage in a direct military confrontation with the United States. Iran does, however, have several allies in the region which it could quickly mobilize. Some pro-Iran groups have already called for action. Muqtada al-Sadr, the head of Iraq's Mahdi army, asked fighters to stand ready shortly after Soleimani's death. Hezbollah, based in Lebanon, have also said they were ready to retaliate, sparking Israeli fears that fighting could spread in that part of the region. Other groups who usually don't see eye to eye have set their differences aside in order to stand united against what they see as an American aggression. Tehran could also ramp up its proxy actions in the region without entering an all-out war.
There's still a question mark on how they will do it against probably the American interest, but that will be not on the same profile. Probably they will be making some hacking computer systems or something like that. So that will be more in the hybrid war than on the direct war.
Iran would likely favor targets that are within close proximity in areas where it knows it has support. U.S. interests in Iraq, for example. The country's prime minister has already expressed fears of a devastating war taking place within its borders. Finally, Tehran could also use its political and military power in the all-important Strait of Hormuz. U.S. naval ships or ships belonging to its allies that transit through the area could be faced with a threat of action from Iranian forces on the coast. Last June, 2 oil tankers were attacked near the Strait of Hormuz. The U.S. blamed Iran for the attack, but Tehran has strongly rejected those claims.
And staying in Iraq, and this coming into us, 2 rockets are reported to have hit Iraq's Balad air base, 80 kilometres north of the capital. No casualties have been reported so far. The base is home to US troops. Meanwhile, a mortar was launched inside Baghdad's Jadriya neighbourhood, wounding 5 people, and more rockets fell inside the so-called Green Zone. The worst-case scenario is, quote, coming to fruition. That's the dire warning voiced by New South Wales' Premier this Saturday, as Australia continues to burn. While large-scale evacuations have minimised the human death toll, which now stands at 23 since September, an astounding 500 million mammals, birds and reptiles are estimated to have been killed. Meanwhile, record-breaking temperatures and gale-force winds are offering little hope of relief and threatening power supplies to major cities. Our correspondent Rochelle Harrison-Pless sends us this update from Sydney.
Australians in fire zones across the country's southeast are bracing themselves as around 200 fires continue to burn in New South Wales and Victoria. Several emergency fire warnings remain in place in both states, but the situation is rapidly changing due to very volatile weather conditions. Well, today it was very hot, dry and windy. The suburb of Penrith here in Sydney notched up a scorching 48.9 degrees Celsius, breaking an 80-year temperature record. Electricity substations in New South Wales were hit by the flames, cutting power to more than 30,000 people in the coastal town of Batemans Bay. Thousands of homes here in Sydney were also affected. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister Scott Morrison has been taking heat over his response to the crisis and for what many perceive as a lack of leadership during this unprecedented emergency. Well, on Saturday, he announced additional defence forces to bolster the existing Army, Navy, Air Force and firefighting efforts. And for the first time in Australian history, there's a compulsory call-out for up to 3,000 Army reservists to help with the bushfire response. Those on the front line are in for a long and difficult night. Authorities say the worst is yet to come and that the full extent of the damage won't be known until Sunday. So there's a very nervous wait amid these horrendous conditions.
The death toll from the recent flooding and landslides in and around Jakarta has risen this Saturday, with Indonesian officials confirming that at least 53 people have been killed, dozens injured and more still missing. Tens of thousands are now crammed in emergency shelters, waiting for the floodwaters to recede as rescue teams focus on finding any survivors and victims under the tons of mud and debris. Thomas Waterhouse reports.
This muddy splish-splosh is now a familiar sound across Indonesia's washed-out communities. After the worst flooding in 6 years hit the Greater Jakarta area earlier this week, the water levels have now started to recede. And things are being put back the right way up and back in their proper place. As a mammoth cleanup gets underway, residents have all been taking stock.
I didn't manage to leave with all of my possessions. I've lost the stall that I run. My house is still there, but the windows and doors have gone.
Here in Lebak, rescue teams have been using a dinghy and a length of rope to pull stranded residents to safety. Around a dozen locals in total are still unaccounted for after the record levels of rain hit the region on New Year's Eve and in the days that followed. Some 192,000 evacuees have been forced to sleep in temporary accommodation, but food and clean water there are running low, and many worry about disease.
My baby gets cold at night.
We're afraid she'll get sick with dengue fever.
Thousands of soldiers and health workers have fanned out to deliver much-needed medication and food supplies, while the government has begun the process of cloud seeding to the west of the capital, where chemicals are sprayed from planes to induce rainfall away from populated areas.
After months of political gridlock, Spain's acting Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez has been addressing MPs this Saturday, hoping to win their backing to form a government. Kicking off several days of debates and votes in Parliament, Sanchez's opening comments saw him pledge to resolve the Catalan independence dispute through dialogue, while assuring lawmakers that neither Spain nor its constitution would break. Here's a clip of his speech.
Spain will not be broken. The constitution will not be broken. What is going to break is the blockade of the progressive government that was elected democratically by the Spanish people. Dialogue must start by us recognizing and listening to one another. There is no other way to resolve this conflict.
Well, our Madrid correspondent Sarah Morris tells us that while he's courting MPs, Sanchez is already coming under fire for the timing of his debate.
Tomorrow, when the first vote will take place, is actually when Spanish children traditionally get their presents from the three wise men. And Spanish cities and towns and villages all have people thronging the streets waiting for processions of the three wise men coming through the streets. A lot of the MPs have had to go down to the Parliament today with suitcases, hoping tomorrow that things will wrap up in time for them to get back home to their families and join those processions. The critics and the opposition in the Parliament say after months of waiting for a government, why did it have to be rushed through at Christmas time? Is this a move to disguise some of the deals that the socialist leader Pedro Sanchez has had to do with some of his allies, notably the Catalan separatists? They say that they will abstain. They will help Pedro Sanchez form a government in return for what Pedro Sanchez announced today, which was bilateral talks between the Spanish central government and the Catalan regional government. And that brought a lot of criticism from the opposition, who said essentially Pedro Sanchez had broken some of his electoral policies and promises, that he had sold out Spain. He was being a traitor. Pedro Sanchez said it was time for dialogue. He said it was time to reset things on Catalonia, and that was the only way forward. He also promised what he said would be a series of policies. He said he would roll back the labour reform, for instance, to help workers that was introduced by the former Conservative government. He also said there would be tax hikes on the rich to help the poor after years of austerity. We're expecting the debate to continue this evening and into tomorrow.
France's anti-terrorism prosecutor has now taken over the investigation into Friday's deadly knife attack in a park on the outskirts of Paris. The assault left one woman dead and two people injured, including the victim's husband. The suspect, a 22-year-old who was shot dead by police, is reported to have had a history of mental illness and was undergoing a course of psychiatric treatment. And we'll end this edition on some cultural news. 60 years ago today, on January 4th, 1960, French author, playwright and philosopher Albert Camus died in a car crash at the age of 46. A controversial figure and Nobel Prize winner, Camus' legacy lives on here in France and beyond. Axel Simon and Wassim Cornet report.
Albert Camus' death 60 years ago stunned France. He was just 46 years old when he died in a car crash southeast of Paris. Camus was a French literary icon. He won the Nobel Peace Prize for Literature at the age of 43. The author of The Stranger, also known as The Outsider in Britain, was also a playwright, a journalist, and a philosopher. More than 20 million copies of his books have been sold, translated into 70 languages. Camus also embraced activism, taking a stand against the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima, the Franco dictatorship in Spain, the horror of Soviet gulags, and the atrocities committed by Nazi Germany. Algeria, where he was born, was often a central part of his writing, but his lack of a clear stance in favor of the country's independence was heavily criticized. His work often spoke of justice, freedom, and revolt, themes that still resonate with today's protest movements. His words, full of hope, are still used in demonstrations around the world, with pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong wearing T-shirts that read, "Freedom is nothing but a chance to be better."
And with that, we leave this edition. For more, stay tuned. There's plenty more coming up on France 24.